The wind howled through the dense forest as Trevor tightened the straps on his backpack. The trailhead was behind him now, and the silence of the woods wrapped around him like a shroud. He'd always loved camping, the solitude, the escape. This trip was supposed to be the perfect way to clear his head after a draining year. He'd chosen a remote site deep in the national forest, one far from the beaten path. The ranger had warned him about the remoteness, emphasizing the lack of cell service and how it might take days for help to arrive if something went wrong. But that's what Trevor wanted: total isolation. By late afternoon, he reached the spot he'd scouted online, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines with a serene lake glinting through the trees. He set up his tent quickly, enjoying the rhythm of the routine. Soon, the sun dipped low, casting the forest in an amber glow. He built a fire and cooked his dinner, the crackling flames warding off the creeping chill. As night fell, Trevor leaned back against a log, staring up at the vast canopy of stars. The forest around him was alive with sound: the chirp of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. He felt small, insignificant in the best possible way. It was exactly what he needed. Then he heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like wood striking wood. Trevor sat up, straining to locate the source. It seemed to come from deeper in the woods, beyond the lake. He told himself it was probably a branch knocking in the wind, or an animal moving through the underbrush. Still, the sound unsettled him, its pattern too deliberate. He turned in for the night, zipping himself into his sleeping bag and telling himself to ignore it. But the tapping continued, faint but persistent, carrying on the wind. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by moments of tense silence when he swore the sound had moved closer. When dawn broke, Trevor emerged from his tent, groggy but eager to shake off the unease. The forest was serene in the daylight, the eerie sounds of the night before replaced by the cheerful chirping of birds. He decided to explore the area, hiking to the far side of the lake to get a better view of the landscape. That's when he found it. A small circle of stones, blackened as if by fire, sat in a clearing. Around it were crude carvings on nearby trees, symbols he didn't recognize, jagged and angular, almost primitive. The sight sent a chill through him, though he couldn't explain why. It wasn't uncommon for campers to leave their marks, but something about this felt wrong. As he stood there, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the usual hum of life dampened as if the woods were holding their breath. He shook off the feeling and made his way back to camp, deciding not to dwell on it. The day passed uneventfully, but as night fell, the unease returned. Trevor fortified his fire, building it higher than usual, its flames casting long, flickering shadows. He tried to distract himself by reading, but every creak of the forest pulled his focus. And then, just as before, the tapping began. This time it was louder and closer. Trevor grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound confident. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. And then he saw them. Two faint pinpricks of light, like eyes reflecting the fire, just beyond the tree line. They didn't blink or move, only stared. Trevor's pulse quickened as he stepped back toward the fire. "Who's there?" he demanded, but the only response was the distant rustle of leaves. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, clutching his utility knife, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. The eyes never reappeared, but the tapping resumed in the early hours of the morning, relentless and maddening. When the first light of dawn broke, Trevor packed up his camp with frantic speed. He decided to cut his trip short, the isolation no longer a comfort, but a threat. As he retraced his steps back to the trailhead, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set his nerves on edge. It was only when he reached his car, safe and sound, that he allowed himself to breathe. He turned the key in the ignition, ready to leave the forest and its eerie secrets behind. But as he pulled onto the dirt road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. In the distance, just at the edge of the tree line, stood a figure. Tall and thin, its features obscured by the shadows of the forest, it raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Trevor didn't stop to look closer. He floored the gas, his tires kicking up gravel as he sped away, vowing never to return to the woods again. To this day, he still hears the tapping sometimes, in his dreams, and occasionally just outside his window. The forest was silent when Sarah and Daniel arrived, far too silent for their liking. It was their annual camping trip, and they had chosen a new spot this time, a remote area marked on the map as Old Hollow. There were no marked trails leading to it, just a vague set of directions from a ranger who had warned them it wasn't commonly used. That should have been their first clue to turn back. They set up camp near clearing, surrounded by towering firs. A shallow creek ran nearby, its babbling the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. As they worked, Sarah noticed something odd. The trees had strange marks on them, slashes and gouges, almost as if clawed by something large. She mentioned it to Daniel, but he shrugged it off, saying, "Probably a bear. Let's just be careful." The first night was uneventful, though Sarah thought she heard faint noises just outside the tent, soft footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. Daniel dismissed her concerns as nerves. "You always freak yourself out here," he said. But the next day, things took a turn. They decided to explore deeper into the forest. About half a mile from their camp, they stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold. A makeshift altar of sorts, built from rocks and twisted branches. Animal bones, small and broken, were scattered around it. Worse, crude symbols were scratched into the stones, shapes neither of them recognized. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel shook his head, backing away. "Let's head back. Now." As they turned to leave, Sarah swore she saw movement in the corner of her eye, a figure darting between the trees. She froze, staring into the dense woods, but nothing moved. Daniel had to grab her arm to pull her along. That night, the noises returned, louder this time. Footsteps circled their tent, slow and deliberate, crunching the dry leaves. Sarah clutched Daniel's arm, her breath shallow and quick. "Who's out there?" Daniel shouted, his voice breaking the silence. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving them in a suffocating silence. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of their hearts, but it grew louder, surrounding them, though they couldn't make out the words. The voices seemed to overlap, high-pitched and guttural, like dozens of people murmuring at once. Daniel unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. "There's no one out here," he muttered, more to himself than Sarah. But he was wrong. The next morning, they found something waiting for them. Hanging from the trees around their campsite were crude stick figures, bound together with bits of thread and hair. Each one had a small animal skull tied to its center, the empty sockets staring lifelessly at the ground. "We're leaving," Daniel said, his voice firm. He began packing up their gear with frantic urgency. As they prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something else. Around their campsite, the forest floor was disturbed, as though something or someone had been pacing in circles around them all night. The hike back to their car felt endless. Every so often, they would hear something behind them, a branch snapping, leaves crunching. Once, Sarah glanced back and thought she saw a shadowy figure standing between the trees, but when she blinked, it was gone. When they finally reached the parking area, relief washed over them, until they saw their car. Scratched into the hood in jagged, overlapping lines was the same symbol they had seen on the altar. They didn't stop to examine it. Daniel unlocked the doors, and they sped away, not stopping until they reached the safety of a gas station miles away. To this day, neither of them speaks about what happened in the woods. But Sarah still wakes up some nights convinced she hears whispering outside her window, and Daniel swears he's seen the same symbol carved into trees near his house. The forest, it seems, is not so easily left behind. The campsite was everything Lauren had hoped for. Isolated, serene, and bordered by a dense forest that stretched for miles. She had planned this solo trip to escape the chaos of her life. Just her, the wilderness, and some peace and quiet. As she unpacked her gear, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. But as the light faded, a strange sensation crept over her, like she wasn't alone. She shook it off. "Just the woods playing tricks on me," she muttered. That first night, as she sat by her campfire, the unease grew. The forest seemed unnaturally still, the usual nighttime symphony of insects and owls eerily absent. She brushed it off again, attributing it to the remoteness of the area. Then she heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves just beyond the circle of light cast by her fire. She froze, her eyes darting toward the sound. "Hello," she called out, trying to steady her voice. Silence. Silence. The crunch came again, this time closer. She grabbed her flashlight and aimed it at the trees. The beam illuminated nothing but trunks and underbrush. Her heart pounded in her chest. Probably a deer, she told herself, though she didn't entirely believe it. She retreated to her tent, zipping it up tightly and keeping her flashlight within arm's reach. Sleep didn't come easy. Sometime in the night, she woke to the faint sound of whispering. It was so quiet she thought she might be imagining it, but as she strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, overlapping and nonsensical, as if several voices were speaking at once. Her throat tightened. She wanted to call out, but fear rooted her in place. She clutched her flashlight and turned it on, shining it through the thin fabric of the tent. The light cast shadows, but nothing moved outside. The whispering stopped abruptly. When morning came, the forest felt different. The air was heavy, and the sense of being watched had intensified. She found something outside her tent that made her blood run cold, small piles of rocks arranged in perfect circles. They hadn't been there the night before. She packed up her gear in a hurry, her nerves on edge. As she moved through the forest, trying to find her way back to the trailhead, the feeling of being followed grew stronger. Every now and then, she'd hear a faint rustling behind her, but every time she turned, there was nothing there. Hours passed, and she realized she was lost. The trail had disappeared, and the trees all looked the same. Panic set in as the sun dipped lower in the sky. She tried to stay calm, using her compass to head in what she thought was the right direction. Then she saw it. In the distance, through the trees, a figure stood. It was tall and still, its face obscured by shadows. She called out, "Hello? Can you help me?" But the figure didn't move. Lauren took a hesitant step forward, but as she did, the figure seemed to melt into the forest, disappearing without a sound. Her breath quickened. She turned and began walking faster, not caring where she was going as long as it was away from whatever she had just seen. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees growing denser and the shadows darker. She heard the whispering again, this time louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from every direction. She broke into a run, branches clawing at her arms and face. The whispering turned to laughter, high-pitched and cruel. She tripped and fell, scraping her knees on the rough ground. When she looked up, she saw the same figure standing a few feet away. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its face was still hidden in shadow. But this time it moved. It stepped toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Lauren scrambled to her feet and ran, the figure's laughter echoing behind her. She didn't stop until she burst into a clearing and saw her car parked in the distance. She didn't look back as she jumped into the driver's seat and sped away, her tires kicking up dirt and gravel. To this day, she refuses to talk about what happened in that forest. But sometimes, when she's alone at night, she swears she can still hear the laughter, faint and distant, as if it's waiting for her to return. The cabin was an unplanned stop, a derelict structure they stumbled upon after losing their way. Ryan, Mia, and Chris had planned a weekend camping trip deep in the Appalachian wilderness, but a wrong turn on an unmarked trail left them wandering for hours. When they found the cabin, it felt like a stroke of luck. "Let's just stay here for the night and figure things out tomorrow," Ryan suggested, pushing the rotted door open. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of decay. The furniture was sparse, a broken table, a single chair, and a fireplace filled with ash. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, crude shapes that seemed to spiral endlessly. Mia hesitated, her instincts screaming to leave, but the sun was setting, and the thought of being stuck outside was worse. As they settled in, the uneasy feeling grew. Chris, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "It's like a scene out of a horror movie," he said, grinning. "What if this place is haunted?" Mia shot him a look. "Not funny." Ryan inspected the symbols on the walls, running his fingers over the rough carvings. "These look old. Maybe this was some kind of, ritual site?" "Rituals for what?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with irritation. Chris laughed. "To summon creepy forest spirits, obviously." They lit a small fire in the fireplace and ate what little food they had left. The cabin creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, and the oppressive silence outside made them feel like they were the only people in the world. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The fire flickered weakly, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. Mia swore the symbols seemed to writhe in the dim light, as if alive. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly. The others fell silent. At first they heard nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. Then it came, a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. It seemed to come from outside, circling the cabin. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the cracked window. "I don't see anything," he said, but his voice betrayed his unease. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. The sound was indistinct, but it sent chills racing down their spines. Chris laughed nervously. "Okay, now it's officially creepy." "Shut up," Mia snapped, her voice trembling. Then the door creaked open. They all froze, staring at the dark gap where the door had been. Ryan aimed his flashlight, but the beam only illuminated the empty doorway and the trees beyond. "Wind," he said quickly, standing and shutting the door. He slid a heavy wooden plank across it, locking it in place. "It's just the wind." But it wasn't. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from inside the cabin now, rising and falling in waves. Chris clutched his head. "Make it stop," he muttered. Ryan and Mia exchanged a terrified glance. The fire died suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. In the pitch black, the whispering turned to laughter, soft and mocking. "Who's there?" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking. In response, the laughter ceased, replaced by heavy, deliberate footsteps. They came from the corner of the room where the shadows were darkest. Mia fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the corner, and there it was. A figure stood there, its body impossibly tall and thin, its face featureless except for deep, empty sockets where its eyes should have been. Its head tilted unnaturally as it took a step forward, one impossibly long limb reaching for them. "Run!" Ryan shouted, grabbing Mia's arm. They bolted from the cabin, not daring to look back. The forest was dark and disorienting, but the adrenaline kept them moving. Behind them, they heard the laughter again, echoing through the trees. Chris's screams tore through the night. Mia stopped, turning toward the sound. "We have to go back," she cried. "No," Ryan pulled her along. "We can't. We'll die if we stop." The laughter grew louder, surrounding them, as if the forest itself was alive and mocking their terror. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. The laughter had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But the forest didn't feel empty. The next morning, rescuers found their abandoned car parked at the trailhead, but there was no sign of Ryan, Mia, or Chris. The only clue was a single, crude symbol carved into the driver's side door, spiraling endlessly. To this day, hikers report hearing laughter in the woods near the cabin. Those who venture too close never come back. The group of 5 friends had always prided themselves on their adventurous spirit, but this camping trip was different. Nestled deep in the Oregon wilderness, far from any established trails or campsites, they had chosen a spot so remote it didn't even show up on their GPS. Pure isolation, Darren said with a grin as they set up their tents. This is what camping's all about. Mara wasn't so sure. Something about the area unsettled her. The trees were twisted in unnatural shapes, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air felt heavier here, and there was an odd stillness. No birds, no insects, just silence. By the time night fell, the unease had spread to the others. Even Darren, always the boldest, seemed quieter than usual. They gathered around the fire, trying to shake the strange feeling. "You guys ever hear about this area?" Rachel asked, her voice low. Eli shook his head. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing at the trees. "I read something online about hikers going missing around here. Dozens over the years. They say there's something in the woods." "Great," Darren muttered. "That's just what we need. Ghost stories." "It's not a ghost," Rachel said. "People say it's a creature, something that mimics voices to lure you deeper into the forest." Mara shivered and moved closer to the fire. "Let's not talk about this, okay? It's creepy enough out here." They fell into an uneasy silence, the fire crackling as their only companion. Later that night, Mara woke to a faint sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but as she listened, she realized it was a voice. It was Rachel. "Mara, come here," the voice whispered, soft and insistent. Mara sat up, her heart pounding. She looked toward Rachel's tent, but it was zipped closed, and she could hear the soft rhythm of her breathing inside. The voice came again, louder this time. "Mara, help me." She grabbed her flashlight and unzipped her tent, stepping into the cold night air. The forest was darker than she'd ever seen it, the trees blocking out even the faintest light from the stars. "Rachel," she called softly. The voice came from deeper in the woods. "Over here." Mara hesitated. It sounded like Rachel, but something about the tone was wrong. Too flat, too deliberate. "Rachel, if this is a joke, it's not funny," she said, her voice shaking. The only response was laughter, low, distorted, and echoing through the trees. Mara's blood ran cold. She backed toward the camp, her flashlight shaking in her hand. When she turned, she froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms too long, its legs too thin. Its face was smooth and blank, save for a gaping black mouth. "Mara," it said in Rachel's voice, the sound dragging like nails on glass. She screamed, running back toward the tents. She burst into Darren's tent, shaking him awake. "What's going on?" he asked groggily. "There's something out there," she whispered, her voice frantic. The others woke, and Mara explained what she'd seen. Darren grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the others following reluctantly. "See?" Darren said, sweeping the beam around the empty clearing. "Nothing's here." But as they stood there, the voice came again. "Darren!" It was Mara's voice this time, calling from the darkness. Darren's bravado faltered. "What the hell?" The voice came closer, echoing from all directions. "Darren, Rachel, Eli, come here." Panic set in, and they huddled together, shining their flashlights wildly into the trees. The laughter returned, louder and more guttural, as if the forest itself was mocking them. Then they saw it. Several figures emerging from the shadows, identical to them in appearance, but with those same smooth faces and gaping mouths. The imposters moved in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded the group, mimicking their voices in eerie, disjointed sentences. "Stay together," Darren shouted, but it was too late. The things lunged and chaos erupted. Flashlights hit the ground, their beams casting frantic streaks of light as the group scattered into the woods. Mara ran blindly, branches whipping her face and arms. The laughter and voices followed her, growing louder and more distorted. She tripped and fell, her flashlight rolling away. In the faint light, she saw one of the figures standing over her. It bent down, its face inches from hers, and whispered in her own voice, "You can't run forever." The next morning, search teams found the campsite. The tents were shredded and the ground was trampled, but there was no sign of the campers. The only clue was a single word scratched into the dirt in front of the fire pit: mimic. To this day, hikers in the area report hearing familiar voices calling them into the woods. Those who follow never return. The group of friends had camped dozens of times before, but this trip to Blackwater Lake felt different. The lake was remote, surrounded by dense forest with a reputation for being unsettling. Locals warned them not to go, spinning tales of people who had disappeared or gone mad after spending a night there. Of course, that only made it more appealing to the group. They arrived late in the afternoon, the fading sunlight casting long shadows over the still water. The air was unnaturally quiet, no birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind whispered through the trees. Emma was the first to notice something strange. "Look at the water," she said, pointing. The surface of the lake was mirror-like, reflecting the surroundings with unnerving clarity. But as they stared, subtle ripples began to form, moving outward in perfect concentric circles. "Fish, maybe?" Tyler suggested, though there was no sign of anything beneath the surface. "It's probably just the wind," Sarah added, though she sounded unsure. They set up their tents and built a fire, trying to shake off the eerie atmosphere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to close in around them. It started with the noises. Low, guttural sounds echoed from the trees, too deep to be animals, too distorted to be human. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the tree line, but the beam only revealed the endless expanse of twisted branches. "Probably coyotes," he said, but his voice was unconvincing. The group huddled closer to the fire, their conversation forced and nervous. Then Emma froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. They listened. At first there was nothing but the crackling of the fire. Then it came, a faint voice, calling from the direction of the lake. "Help me?" It was barely audible, but the desperation in the tone was unmistakable. "Someone's out there," Sarah said, standing up. "Don't," Emma said quickly. "It's probably just the wind. Or..." She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. The voice came again, louder this time. Please, I'm lost. Against Emma's protest, Tyler grabbed his flashlight and started toward the lake. Sarah followed, and Emma reluctantly brought up the rear. The moonlight illuminated the water, which was now perfectly still. But standing at the edge of the lake was a figure, a woman, her back to them. Are you okay? Tyler called out, shining his flashlight on her. The woman didn't move. Sarah stepped closer. Do you need help? The woman turned slowly, and the group recoiled. Her face was pale and featureless, with smooth, blank skin where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The group froze in terror as the figure tilted its head as if studying them. Then, without warning, it began to move, gliding toward them, its body unnaturally fluid. Run! Tyler shouted, grabbing Emma's arm. They bolted back toward the campsite, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing behind them. When they reached the fire, the figure was gone. But the relief was short-lived. The guttural noises from the forest grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Did you hear that? Sarah said, her voice shaking. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was their voices, calling to them from the darkness. Tyler, come here. Emma, help me. The mimicry was perfect, but there was something wrong, an unnatural cadence, as if the voices were being stretched and twisted. Stay together, Tyler said, grabbing a stick from the fire. But it didn't matter. The forest erupted with movement as figures emerged from the trees. They were grotesque distortions of the human form. Long limbs, hollow eyes, and gaping mouths that emitted guttural, inhuman sounds. The group scattered, each of them pursued by the creatures. Emma ran blindly, the flashlight shaking in her hand. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more urgent. She tripped over a root, the flashlight flying from her grip and landing a few feet away. As she reached for it, she froze. Standing over her was one of the creatures, its hollow eyes fixed on her. It opened its mouth and her own voice came out. Emma, why did you leave me? She screamed, scrambling backward as the creature lunged. The next morning, park rangers found the campsite. The fire had long since burned out and the tents were torn apart, but there was no sign of the campers. The only clue was a single, muddy footprint leading from the edge of the lake back into the forest. To this day, locals warn against camping at Blackwater Lake. They say the voices will call to you, and if you answer, you'll never leave. The dense forest of Crescent Hollow was known for its untamed beauty and eerie reputation. Hikers and campers flocked there, drawn by tales of untouched wilderness and warnings of unexplainable events. James, Sophia, and their friends Megan and Liam shrugged off the rumors as mere local folklore. They were there to enjoy nature, nothing more. The group set up camp near an overgrown trail that didn't appear on any maps. The air was colder than they expected, and the trees seemed unnaturally tall, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. By the time the fire was crackling, night had fallen, bringing with it an oppressive silence. As they sat around the fire, laughing and sharing stories, Megan tilted her head. Do you guys hear that? Hear what? James asked, poking the fire with a stick. Like a bell, she said, her eyes narrowing as she strained to listen. The group went quiet. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then they heard it, a faint, rhythmic chime, like a small handbell being rung far in the distance. Sophia frowned. What would a bell be doing out here? Probably some other campers messing around, Liam said dismissively. But the sound continued, growing louder and more deliberate. Ding, ding, ding. Okay, that's weird, James admitted, standing up. I'm gonna check it out. Are you serious? Megan asked, her voice rising. Why don't we just stay here? It's probably nothing, he said, grabbing a flashlight. Reluctantly, the others followed him into the forest. The bell's chime guided them deeper, its source always just out of reach. The trees grew denser, and the ground became uneven, littered with roots and moss-covered stones. As they walked, Sophia stopped suddenly. Wait, do you see that? Ahead through the trees was a faint light, a soft golden glow. It flickered like a lantern, swaying gently as if carried by someone. Hello, James called out. The bell stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the light moved, jerking suddenly as if reacting to James's voice. Maybe we should head back, Megan whispered. But before anyone could agree, the light moved closer, and the group froze. Emerging from the darkness was a figure draped in tattered black robes. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its hands, thin and skeletal, clutched an old, rusted bell. It raised the bell and rang at once. Ding! The sound was deafening, echoing through the forest like a thunderclap. The group turned and ran, their panic driving them back toward the camp. When they finally stumbled into the clearing, the fire had gone out. Everything was wrong. The tents were torn, their supplies scattered, and carved into the dirt around the campsite were strange symbols, looping and angular like something out of ancient ritual. "What the hell is this?" Liam whispered, his voice trembling. The bell rang again, closer this time. The group turned toward the sound, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the figure, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It raised its hand and the bell rang again. And then another figure appeared. And another. Soon, a circle of them surrounded the group, each holding a bell, their skeletal hands trembling as they prepared to ring. "We need to run!" Megan screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The figures began ringing their bells in unison, the sound piercing and disorienting. James dropped to his knees, clutching his ears. "Stop it! Stop it!" But the ringing only grew louder, accompanied by whispers, dozens of voices speaking in a language none of them could understand. The air grew colder and the forest seemed to close in, the trees twisting and writhing as if alive. The last thing Megan saw before she passed out was one of the figures reaching for her, its skeletal fingers brushing her face. When she woke up, the sun was rising. The campsite was empty. James, Sophia, and Liam were gone, and the symbols carved into the ground had vanished. Megan stumbled back to civilization, her story dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized survivor. Search parties found no trace of her friends, and the locals avoided the topic entirely. Years later, hikers still report hearing the faint chime of a bell in Crescent Hollow. Those who follow it are never seen again. The air in Pine Haven Forest always carried a strange stillness at night, as if the trees were holding their breath. Kayla and her boyfriend, Ryan, along with their friends Eric and Melissa, had chosen a remote clearing for their camping trip. They wanted to escape the city and immerse themselves in nature, but by the second night, Kayla wished they'd chosen somewhere else. The first night had been uneventful, save for the unnerving silence. No birds, no crickets, just the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Ryan had joked about it, calling it pristine wilderness, but Kayla couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. On the second night, as they sat around the campfire, Eric noticed something odd. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, pointing toward the forest edge. "See what?" Ryan asked, poking at the fire. "I swear I saw something move out there, like a shadow." "Probably just an animal," Melissa said, though her voice wavered. But when Kayla glanced in the direction Eric had pointed, she saw it too. A dark shape, human-like but unnaturally tall, slipped between the trees. It was there for only a moment before vanishing into the shadows. "Okay, that was weird," Kayla said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Maybe we should go inside the tents for the night." Ryan laughed. "Come on, it's probably nothing. Let's just enjoy the fire." Reluctantly, they stayed by the fire, but the mood had shifted. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made them jump. Then, around midnight, a sound broke the uneasy quiet, a deep, guttural voice calling from the forest. "Help me." The group froze. The voice was raspy, strained, and far too close. "Did someone just—" Melissa started, but Eric cut her off. "Shh, listen. Help me." The voice came again, dragging out the words as if whoever was speaking was struggling to breathe. "Someone might be hurt," Ryan said, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll go check it out." "No, don't," Kayla pleaded, grabbing his arm. "This doesn't feel right." Ryan shrugged her off. "If it were you out there, you'd want someone to help." Eric hesitated, then stood. "I'll go with you." The two disappeared into the forest, their flashlight beams bouncing between the trees. Kayla and Melissa waited by the fire, the seconds stretching into agonizing minutes. Then the scream came, sharp, panicked, and cut short. Kayla jumped to her feet. "Ryan? Eric?" There was no answer. The forest was deathly silent once more. Melissa grabbed Kayla's hand. "We need to go find them." Reluctantly, they ventured into the trees, armed with only a flashlight and a kitchen knife. The beam of light illuminated the dense undergrowth, but there was no sign of Ryan or Eric. "Help me." The voice came again, louder this time. It was ahead of them, but something about it was wrong. The tone, the cadence, it was identical to the first time they'd heard it, as if on a loop. "Ryan?" Kayla called out, her voice trembling. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment they saw it, a figure standing between the trees. It was impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, with skin that looked stretched and pale under the light. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and it opened its mouth. "Help me." The words came from the creature's mouth, but its lips didn't move. It was mimicking the voice, repeating it with eerie precision. Melissa screamed, dropping the flashlight, and they ran. The beam from the fallen flashlight spun wildly, casting fleeting shadows of the creature as it moved. Fast. Far too fast for something so large. They burst back into the clearing, but the fire had gone out. The tents were slashed open, their belongings strewn across the ground. Kayla grabbed Melissa's arm, dragging her toward the car parked nearby. When they reached it, the keys were gone. The driver's side door was wide open, and the interior was smeared with what looked like handprints, too large and too many fingers to be human. "Help me." The voice came again, this time right behind them. Kayla turned, and the last thing she saw was the creature, looming over her, its hollow eyes glinting with malice. The next morning, the campsite was empty. No trace of Kayla, Melissa, Ryan, or Eric was ever found. Search parties reported strange markings carved into the trees and the faint echo of a voice calling for help. Locals now warn against camping in Pine Haven Forest. They say the forest takes on a life of its own after dark, and if you hear someone calling for help, you should run the other way. The dense wilderness of Shadow Pines was notorious among seasoned campers. It was said that once you entered, the forest had a way of pulling you deeper, distorting your sense of time and direction. Julia, her boyfriend Mark, and their two friends Lisa and Trevor decided the rumors were nothing more than campfire tales. They were experienced hikers, equipped with GPS, plenty of supplies, and confidence. The first 2 days were uneventful, filled with laughter and exploration. By the third night, though, the forest felt different. The air was heavy, and the silence pressed in on them like a weight. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, seemed absent. As they sat around the fire that evening, Lisa frowned. "Do you hear that?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "It's like humming," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Julia strained to listen. At first, there was nothing. But then, faint and melodic, came the sound, a low, rhythmic hum, almost like a lullaby. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, brushing it off. But Trevor looked uneasy. "Wind doesn't sound like that." The humming grew louder as the night wore on, weaving in and out of their conversations until it was impossible to ignore. Julia tried to pinpoint its direction, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When they finally retreated to their tents, Julia couldn't sleep. The humming had stopped, but now there was something worse, a faint whispering, like a dozen voices murmuring just outside the tent. "Mark," she hissed, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled, groggy. "Listen," she said, her voice shaking, but the whispering stopped the moment he opened his eyes. "It's just your imagination," he said, rolling over. Julia lay awake for hours, her heart pounding, until exhaustion finally claimed her. The next morning, Lisa was gone. Her tent was unzipped, her sleeping bag untouched. They called for her, their voices echoing through the forest, but there was no response. "Maybe she went to use the bathroom and got lost," Mark suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Trevor found her backpack near the edge of their campsite. The straps were torn, as if it had been yanked from her shoulders. "Something's not right," Trevor said. The group spent the day searching for Lisa, but as the sun began to set, they had no choice but to return to camp. That night, the humming returned louder than before. It was joined by the faint sound of footsteps circling their tents. Julia clutched Mark's arm. "It's out there." "What is?" "Whatever took Lisa." Trevor, clutching a flashlight, unzipped his tent. "I'm not sitting here waiting to find out." "Trevor, don't!" Julia whispered urgently, but he was already outside. Mark grabbed his flashlight and followed. Julia had no choice but to go with them. The forest was pitch black, their flashlights casting long, jittery shadows on the trees. The humming seemed to guide them, pulling them deeper into the woods. "What's that?" Mark asked, his light catching on something up ahead. It was Lisa. She was standing in the middle of a clearing, her back to them. "Lisa!" Trevor shouted, running toward her. Julia grabbed his arm. "Wait! Look at her!" Lisa's head tilted slightly, and her body swayed, almost like she was dancing to the humming. Her movements were slow and unnatural, as if she were being controlled by invisible strings. "Lisa, are you okay?" Mark asked, stepping closer. She turned to face them, and Julia's stomach dropped. Lisa's eyes were wide and unblinking, her pupils so dilated that they were almost black. Her mouth was open, but the humming was coming from deep within her throat, as though she were a human amplifier. "Run," Lisa said suddenly, her voice flat and mechanical. They didn't need to be told twice. As they fled, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees twisted and shifted, blocking paths that hadn't been there moments before. The humming grew deafening, and Julia risked a glance behind her. Lisa was following them, but she wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures moved between the trees, their bodies contorted and misshapen. Their movements were erratic, like broken marionettes, and their hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark. When the group burst back into their campsite, Julia realized Trevor wasn't with them. "Where's Trevor?" she screamed. Mark shook his head, panicked. "He was right behind us!" The humming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt unnatural. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped into the firelight. It was Trevor, but something was wrong. His eyes were like Lisa's, wide, dark, and empty. His mouth opened, and the humming resumed. The shadowy figures emerged from the forest, closing in around them. Julia grabbed Mark's hand, and they ran blindly into the woods, the sound of the humming chasing them like a predator. To this day, Julia doesn't know how they made it out alive. She and Mark stumbled onto a highway at dawn, their clothes torn and their bodies bruised. Lisa and Trevor were never found, and neither was their campsite. But late at night, when everything is still, Julia swears she can hear the humming faint and persistent as if it's calling her back.